Okay, let's see.
Number 12. Roman dodecahedrons. A trowel scrapes through Lincolnshire soil, and for a second it looks like junk metal. Then the dirt falls away. 12 perfect faces, circular holes, each a different size, knobs at every corner. Not crushed, not broken, whole. It had been sitting in a pit for roughly 1,700 years, beside Roman pottery, waiting until the very end of a community dig in June 2023 to surface in Trench 4. No metal detector led anyone to it. It came out of the ground with its context intact, as if the past had finally decided to leave the object where its story could still be read. About 8 centimeters across, 245 grams, cast in a copper alloy rich enough to justify careful work. Roman craftsmen could make objects this precise, yet the knowledge around them vanished so completely that we still cannot say what one was for. You are kneeling at the edge of Trench 4 at Norton Disney, in a field that already holds the outlines of a Roman villa landscape under the grass. June light, dry soil. 4 open trenches cut into the earth by a community archaeology team that is almost out of time. The easy finds have already come and gone in little trays and labeled bags. Pottery, soil changes, fragments. The kind of patient evidence that builds a Roman world, one scrape at a time. Then the trowel catches on something harder than root and cleaner than stone. At first there is only a curve, green-brown with corrosion, the color old copper alloys take after centuries underground. Too regular to be natural, too thick to be a can or a modern scrap. The scraping slows. Dirt is brushed away in grains, not clumps. One opening appears, then another, then a flat face between them. Then the little rounded knob at a corner, then another. The shape does not resolve into anything familiar. The more of it you expose, the stranger it gets. A volunteer lifts it free. It fits in one hand, but only just, about 8 centimeters across, heavy for its size at 245 grams, hollow, 12 pentagonal faces. A hole cut through each face, but not the same hole repeated 12 times. Some are wider, some narrower. Every vertex capped with a small projecting knob, as if the object has armored joints. It is complete, undamaged. No flattened edge, no cracked panel, no obvious place where a handle snapped off, because there was never a handle to begin with. Around it, the trench goes still in that very particular archaeological way, where everybody keeps moving but nobody is breathing normally. This is not just a find, it is a context. Most Roman dodecahedrons entered museums like orphans, pulled from fields, dredged from rivers, found by chance, passed from hand to hand with the story stripped off. This one has a place, a pit, Roman pottery with it, soil layers around it, a sequence. The object did not simply appear, it was recovered from the act that buried it. You are not just holding metal. You are standing at the edge of a decision made in the 3rd or 4th century CE by someone who lowered this thing into the ground and left it there. The first instinct is to rotate it. You turn it toward the sun. Each face frames a different circle. The holes refuse symmetry, not chaos. Something more unsettling, intention without explanation. If this were a tool, you would expect repetition, standard sizes, clear wear on the rims, a logic your fingers could feel. The surfaces do not give you that. They give you craftsmanship. Later, archaeometallurgist Jerry McDonnell tests the alloy with XRF, and the numbers come back like a recipe from a vanished workshop. Roughly 75% copper, 7% tin, 18% lead. Not accidental, not improvised from trash. A cast object made by someone who knew exactly how metal should flow, cool, fill, and survive. Enough lead to help the poor, enough tin to harden the alloy. Enough copper to make the whole thing worth the labor. An object like this was not dashed off between more important commissions. It cost skill. Still, skill explains almost nothing. Even in your hand, the dodecahedron behaves badly. It does not tell you where to grip it. It does not show abrasion where a cord sawed across it year after year. It does not carry soot in one predictable pattern. The holes differ. The scale differs from find to find across the Roman world. Some are 4 centimeters across, some climb toward 11. One British Museum example from Fishguard is far larger, with apertures running from 27.67 to 40.55 millimeters, and a weight over 553 grams. Same family, no standard body. If it was a measuring device, the measure changed every time. If it was a tool, the working surfaces do not agree. If it was a piece of equipment, its manual is gone so completely that not a single Roman mosaic, relief, or written source has stepped forward to say, this. The field at Norton Disney suddenly feels bigger than a field. This object is not unique. It is one more voice in a choir of silence. Around 130 Roman dodecahedrons are known across the Roman world, with a concentration in Northern Europe and Britain. None are known from Italy. This one became the 33rd from Roman Britain and the first from the Midlands. Whatever it was not a one-off eccentricity cast by a bored smith on a rainy afternoon. It belonged to a pattern, a real one, shared enough to spread across provinces, rare enough to stay expensive, important enough to be made again and again, yet somehow not important enough to be named where we can read it. You look back down into the pit, pottery sherds, soil discoloration, the little cavity where the object sat all that time. The possibility begins to shift. Maybe it was not dropped. Maybe it was placed. Some of the strangest parallels do not point toward workshops at all. They point toward deposition, toward temples, graves, rivers, cult places. One example from Lydney came from the temple complex of Nodens. Another German find turned up near a Mercury Hermes Thoth statuette. Norton Disney may be another of those moments where the object was used not until it wore out, but until a ritual ended and burial became the final act. So you picture the hand that last held it before yours. Not a volunteer in gloves under English sun, but a Roman hand above a pit nearly 17 centuries earlier. The object turns once, metal catching light, pottery lowered with it. No speech survives, if there was speech. No inscription, if there ever should have been one. Just a careful placement, and then soil, layer over layer, the act sealed shut. That is what changes the mood in the trench. A broken tool in a ditch is easy. A lost household object is easy. But a complete dodecahedron, carefully made, apparently undamaged, set into a pit with Roman material and left there on purpose, that is not random survival. It is deliberate disappearance. By the time the find is logged, bagged, and carried away for study, the mystery has narrowed and deepened at once. The context is better than usual. The object is whole. The composition is known. The date is likely 3rd or 4th century. The location is secure. The excavation story is clean. The central fact does not move. The more precisely this thing enters history, the less it explains itself. It was not lost. It was buried. Number 11. Phaistos Disc. On July 3, 1908, Italian archaeologist Luigi Pernier was digging through the palace of Phaistos in southern Crete under a legal excavation concession, the kind of formal document that turns a buried ruin into a state-controlled dig, and every object in it into evidence. In a basement room of the northeastern complex, one of his foremen lifted out something that did not look important at all. Not gold, not a blade, not a royal seal, just a fired clay disc, about 16 centimeters across and barely 2 centimeters thick. Both faces were packed with tiny images pressed into the surface in a tightening spiral. 241 signs in all, broken into 61 groups, made from 45 distinct symbols. A human head with a crest, a shield, a flower, a bird, a tool. It looked less like handwriting than machinery. Someone had stamped those signs into wet clay one by one, as if the Bronze Age had briefly discovered printing and then forgotten it. The context mattered at once. Pernier was working inside the world of Minoan Crete, a palace culture already known for scripts, storage, and administration. Nearby lay a linear A tablet, exactly the kind of association an archaeologist wants when proving an object belongs to its setting. The disc entered the record with the protection of place, palace, basement room, companion inscription, early 2nd millennium BCE. The Heraclean Museum now dates it to roughly 1700 to 1650 BCE. But context could only carry Pernier so far. The object refused to read. It did not behave like linear A. It did not match linear B. It did not sit comfortably inside Cretan hieroglyphic either. The disc arrived with credentials, but no language. You can feel the change if you follow Pernier from the trench to the desk. In the ground, he had a find. Above ground, he had a problem. Every excavator wants the artifact that clarifies a civilization. This one did the opposite. It came from a palace archive world, yet behaved like an orphan. The signs repeated in ways that looked deliberate. The groupings looked word-like. At the outer edge of each face, A vertical line with 5 dots appears to mark the beginning, and the sequence seems to run inward toward the center. The object almost tells you how to read it. It is not random decoration. It is not casual doodling. It is a message built to be decoded. That is what makes it so cruel. Not absence, but apparent readability without a key. Over the years, scholars did what scholars always do when a text will not open. They attacked the pattern. Some counted frequencies. Some searched for refrains. Some treated the 61 groups as words in a hymn or prayer, because certain clusters recur like a chorus. Others pushed toward calendars, inventories, liturgies, military rosters, fertility songs, even a board game. Amateur decoders arrived in waves. Professional ones arrived more carefully, but they hit the same wall. A script can be cracked when you have a bilingual text, a larger archive, or at least a family resemblance strong enough to anchor sound values. Pernier had none of those. He had one disk, one object almost unique in the archaeological record. Historical science has an especially ugly sentence for cases like this. There are not enough examples. The sting is simple. If the disk were unreadable because it was damaged, that would be ordinary bad luck. But it is not damaged in the way that matters. The signs are there. The structure is there. The order is there. The manufacturing technique is there. You can count it, classify it, map it, model it. Modern computational studies can tell you exactly how many symbol types appear and how they cluster. Museum labels can tell you where it was found, how large it is, how it was made. None of that gives you a single, secure pronunciation. You are looking at a text with the body of language and none of the voice. For a civilization built on administration, storage, and record-keeping, the irony is brutal. The object survives. The reading tradition does not. Then the larger question starts pressing through the clay. Why does hard-won knowledge that took generations to master vanish without a trace, and who benefits when it does? If the Phaistos Disc is authentic, someone in Bronze Age Crete knew exactly what these 45 symbols meant. Maybe not everyone, maybe only priests, scribes, or a tiny workshop using a one-off stamped system. But somebody could pick it up, follow the spiral from the edge inward, and hear sense, a chant, a formula, an account, an imported text, a ritual script. Then the chain broke so completely that 3,600 years later, we cannot even prove what kind of text we are holding. The knowledge did not slowly blur, it snapped. That break is why the hoax theory never fully dies. In 2008, art historian and dealer Jerome Eisenberg argued the disc might be a 100-year-old fake and suggested thermoluminescence testing as the decisive test. The suspicion is easy to understand. The disc is almost too perfect a provocation. It is singular. It is dramatic. In one respect, it looks uncannily modern, because the signs were stamped rather than handwritten, making it resemble a miniature printing experiment long before printing should exist. And it was found by a man whose discovery instantly became famous. That combination is gasoline for doubt. But doubt cuts both ways. The case against a hoax runs through Pernier's original context. Palace setting. Associated linear A tablet. Controlled excavation. Minoan material around it. If it was forged, the forgery did not just imitate an artifact. It infiltrated an archaeological event. So Luigi Pernier's place in this story is stranger than simple triumph. On the day of discovery, he seemed to win the archaeologist's lottery. A unique object, a secure context, a script no one had seen before. But the better the find was logged, the harsher the puzzle became. A looted object can be blamed on missing context. A stray antiquities market curiosity can be dismissed as rootless. Pernier had the one defense every excavator wants. He had provenance in the ground. The disc could not be waved away easily. It had to be taken seriously. Because it had to be taken seriously, generations of scholars were forced into the same humiliating position, staring at a message that plainly means something and being unable to extract even one line from it with confidence. The curse of the Phaistos Disc is not that it looks magical, it looks legible. It was not a relic saved by mystery. It was a text abandoned by its own readers. And all Pernier could really pass on to the future was the oldest, sharpest fact in the file, in a room of the Palace of Phaistos. Number 10. Saqqara Bird. In 1969, inside a gallery of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, physician Khalil Masiha stopped in front of a small wooden object most visitors would have passed without a second glance. It was about 18 centimeters long, carved from sycamore wood, catalogued under JE 33109 and SR 4/6347. For years, it had lived the quiet life of a labeled ancient thing, wooden bird. Messiha was not just a doctor, he was also a model aircraft enthusiast. Where another eye saw a ritual bird, he saw a fuselage. Straight wings, a vertical tail, no legs, no painted feathers. In his hand-sized view, it looked less like a falcon and more like a machine, reduced to miniature. The sensation started there, not in a laboratory or a tomb, but in a glance. The object had entered the Cairo Museum system decades earlier, during Victor Loret's work in the Memphis necropolis near Saqqara in the late 1890s. After that, the popular version hardened fast. The piece became a model glider from about 200 BCE, or the 3rd century BCE, discovered in a tomb, overlooked by Orthodox scholars, then recognized by the one man with the right set of eyes. By 1980, Messiha had published the claim in the Journal of African Civilizations under the title African Experimental Aeronautics, a 2,000-year-old model glider. The title did not whisper, it detonated. If that claim were true, the implications were huge. A Ptolemaic artifact, roughly 305 to 30 BCE, would no longer be just a carved bird. It would be a surviving model of aerodynamic knowledge from the ancient world, a lost experiment, a vanished tradition. Another case in the long pattern where knowledge takes generations to master, then disappears so completely that later ages mistake it for myth. This case is slippery because almost nothing dramatic happened to the object itself. The wood did not change, the measurements did not change, the tail did not change, only the frame around it changed. First, wooden bird, then ancient aircraft. Start with the wings. Believers point to the plan form immediately. The wings are not spread like a decorative bird in mid-display. They are straight, almost severe. The body narrows like a fuselage. The tail rises vertically. That feature does most of the work in popular retellings, because a vertical tail on a small ancient carving feels unnervingly familiar. It creates that jolt of recognition. You are looking at something old, but it seems to speak in a modern design language. Then, the supporting claims arrive. Messiha's brother built a balsa wood replica. Later tellings say it flew. Some versions go further and suggest the original once had a missing horizontal stabilizer, which would have made it even more aircraft-like. From there, the story feeds itself. An object that looks like a glider must have flown. If it flew, the missing piece must have existed. If the missing piece existed, then the carving becomes evidence of ancient aeronautics. The strongest parts of the myth are not carved into the wood. They are built around absences. Now switch from sensation to forensics. The first problem is provenance. The artifact is real. The context is not nearly as solid as the legend likes to pretend. A modern skeptical review, citing communication from the Egyptian Museum's Registration Collection Management and Documentation Department, noted that the exact find spot is not recorded clearly, and the object is not cleanly identified in Loret's 1899 notes. That matters because one of the most repeated details in the story is that it came from the tomb of Pa Di Men in 1898. Maybe it did. Maybe that attribution hardened later through repetition. If the paperwork under it is weak, then the clean discovery story is weaker than advertised. That cuts against both sides. It does not prove the object is a glider. It also means the most cinematic version of its excavation may be less certain than the brochure version. The second problem is anatomy. If this is a bird, why no legs? Why so little feather detail? Fair questions. But ancient carved birds were not engineering drawings. They were symbolic objects, simplified on purpose, shaped by craft conventions and ritual meaning as much as by anatomy. Egyptology does not need the carving to look naturalistic. It only needs it to fit a known world of wooden votive forms and sacred bird imagery from the Ptolemaic period. Aviation claims need much more. They need this object to behave like a flying machine, so test it. In 2023, Michel Zero and Leon Leisman published a computational fluid dynamics study in Acta Mechanica et Automatica. No romance, no secret lost runway in the desert, just the object, as it exists, subjected to aerodynamic analysis. Their simulation used an inflow velocity of 10 meters per second. The question was simple. Does the Saqqara bird possess the qualities you would expect from a workable glider model? The answer was blunt. Poor stability, poor glide behavior, uncontrolled roll. The artifact did not perform like a clever ancient sailplane hiding in plain sight. It behaved like a carved object being asked to do a job it was never designed to do. The tail, the feature that launched 1,000 television segments, turns out to be the most deceptive clue in the case. Yes, it looks aircraft-like. That is not the same as being aerodynamic. A vertical tail alone does not rescue an unstable body. The argument that a horizontal stabilizer has been lost is exactly that, an argument, not a surviving part, not a join line everyone agrees on, not proof. The moment you need an invisible component to make the object work, you are no longer reading evidence, you are repairing a theory. There is also the scale problem. 18 centimeters is enough to fit in your palm. That makes the artifact intimate, almost toy-like, which is perfect for the imagination. You can picture someone holding it up, squinting, feeling the whole forbidden story snap into place. But scale can mislead. Small carved things often exaggerate the one feature a maker once recognized and simplify the rest. That is how symbolic objects survive, not by technical completeness, but by visual shorthand. Strip the wonder away, and the dry file looks like this. A sycamore wood object from the late 1890s museum pipeline, probably Ptolemaic, roughly 3rd century BCE in popular dating, rediscovered in effect by Khalil Masiha in 1969, reframed in 1980 as a 2,000-year-old glider, re-examined in 2023 under CFD and found wanting. The sensational version says ancient aviation was buried and ignored. The evidence says something narrower and much more familiar. A suggestive shape met a modern obsession, and the obsession did the flying. One piece in the file still refuses to sit still. When the aerodynamic miracle falls away, the archival mystery remains. The Saqqara Bird may not be a lost aircraft at all, yet the story everyone repeats about exactly where it came from is shakier than it should be. The last image is not a glider over the Nile. It is Victor Leray in the Saqqara excavations of the late 1890s, writing notes that do not cleanly pin this bird to the tomb people keep naming, while the little wooden shape that started all of it is already slipping into a museum category vague enough to hide it. Number 9. Baghdad Battery. In 1938, Wilhelm Koenig sat with a vessel only about 13 to 14 centimeters tall and decided it might belong to the history of electricity. He was working with the Iraq Museum, examining material linked to Kujut Rabu, near Baghdad, from finds first uncovered in 1936. What caught his eye was not decoration. It was the construction, a ceramic pot. Inside it, a rolled copper cylinder. Through that, an iron rod. At the top, bitumen sealed the assembly in place. 3 parts: clay, copper, iron. It looks less like ornament than a simple schematic. Start with the mechanism. Copper and iron are different metals. Put them into an acidic liquid, and you have the basic condition for a galvanic cell. Not much power. Modern replicas usually produce around 0.5 to 1 volt when filled with vinegar, grape juice, or another weak acid. Enough to move a needle, enough to make headlines, enough for a modern mind to look at a container that appears 2,000 years old and think, battery. The idea survives because the numbers seem to fit. 13 centimeters is small enough to hold in one hand. 1 volt feels just plausible enough. The dating usually assigned to the object, somewhere between roughly 150 BCE and 650 CE, places it in the Parthian or Sasanian world. Ancient enough to sound impossible, specific enough to sound real. That is all a legend needs to start moving. But the same numbers also narrow the claim. A battery is not just a jar that can produce current. It has to belong to a system. You need an electrolyte. You need a circuit. You need some way for current to travel and do work when it arrives. So look back at the file. No wires, no clear terminals, no surviving connector, no plating bath, no workshop, no confirmed object from that period showing secure electroplating by electrical means. The strongest objection was never that Koenig's device could not make voltage. It can. The problem is simpler. Voltage by itself proves almost nothing. The claim rests on a very small base. 1 pot, about 13 or 14 centimeters high, a copper cylinder inside, an iron rod at the center, a bitumen cap at the top. Fill it today with acid, and you get about 1 volt. From there, the argument leaps to ancient electricity. Almost all the weight sits in that leap. Koenig pushed the idea between 1938 and 1940. He suggested the device may have been used to plate silver objects with gold. That mattered because gilding already existed. Gold-coated surfaces were real. The battery theory offered a seductive missing step. Not magic, not myth, but a lost method. A technical trick once known, once used, then forgotten. That kind of story grips people fast. It turns every museum case into a warning that knowledge can vanish, and later generations may mistake the leftovers for ritual junk. Archaeology is harsh on missing links. If electroplating happened, where are the plated objects? Where is the chain of evidence from jar to process to result? British museum specialists and conservation experts pointed to a more ordinary answer. The gilded artifacts Koenig had in mind did not need electricity. Fire gilding and mercury gilding already explained them. Heat, mercury, gold. Crude by modern safety standards, but effective. The glamorous theory did not collide with impossibility. It collided with methods already known to work. Once a known technique is on the table, the mystery changes shape. The question is no longer, could this work? It becomes, why build a second explanation on weaker evidence? There is another number in this story, and it may matter most. 0. 0 documented excavation context strong enough to settle the argument. The jar is usually linked to finds from 1936 near Kujut Rabu, not far from Ctesiphon. But the context was poorly recorded. That sounds minor. It is not. Context is what separates an object from a machine. Without it, a copper and iron assembly floats loose from the room it stood in. The tools beside it, the residue inside it, the objects around it, the habits of the people who handled it. Without context, you can prove possibility. You cannot prove purpose. And purpose is where the whole case starts to wobble. Critics argued that Koenig may have been looking backward through modern eyes. By the early 20th century, electrochemical processes were already familiar. Ceramic vessels, metal rods, plating baths, these were visible technologies. Picture a researcher in Baghdad who has seen modern or near-modern metalworkers using ceramic containers and plating-like processes. Then picture him studying an ancient jar with metal parts fitted inside. The resemblance would be hard to shake. The risk was not fraud, it was projection. A 19th century method cast backward onto an ancient object because the shape invited the comparison. You can feel how easily the story locks together. 2 metals plus acidic liquid equals 1 volt. 1 volt plus missing context becomes a narrative. And that narrative answers an old fear, that knowledge can disappear so completely that later generations no longer recognize what they are holding. But the evidence never grows, not a laboratory, not a network, not even one proven use case, just a vessel that can behave electrically under the right conditions. Can produce current is not the same as was designed to power a process. One is chemistry, the other is history. Then the object's afterlife made the case even harder to test. In April 2003, after the fall of Baghdad, the Iraq Museum was looted. Thousands of artifacts were stolen, damaged, or displaced. In the chaos that followed, the present location of the so-called Baghdad Battery became widely described as unknown. The artifact at the center of the argument suddenly became harder to inspect at the exact moment the world grew most interested in it. No better context surfaced. No wires surfaced. No electroplated Parthian showpiece surfaced. The jar receded, and the legend advanced. Officially, the Baghdad Battery remains an intriguing but unproven interpretation. A clay jar from a weakly documented context, dated broadly between 150 BCE and 650 CE, capable in replica form of generating roughly 0.5 to 1 volt, but unsupported by the rest of the circuit archaeology would need. People remember it as a machine. The evidence still leaves it as an object. Number 8. Nebra Sky Disk. On February 23, 2002, in a hotel in Basel, Swiss police closed in on what looked like a black market sale of bronze scrap. On the table lay a green-blue disc about 32 centimeters across, hammered thin to roughly 4.6 millimeters at the center, and barely 1.5 to 1.8 at the edge. Gold shapes were scattered across its face, like pieces of a broken knight. State archaeologist Harold Meller had helped set the recovery in motion with authorities from Saxony-Anhalt. The sellers thought they were unloading loot. Science may have been getting back a Bronze Age picture of the world. By the time police seized the disc, nearly 3 years had passed since the summer of 1999. That was when 2 illegal detectorists hacked it out of the wooded summit of Middelburg Hill near Nebra with the rest of the horde. 2 swords, 2 axes, 2 arm spirals, and 1 chisel. They gouged the disc during recovery. They cleaned it badly. Then they pushed it into the market, dealer to dealer, story to story. An object that may preserve one of Europe's oldest celestial images reached scholars not through excavation, but through a crime. Take the official version as procedure, not legend. Around 1600 BC, about 3,600 years ago, someone may have climbed Middelburg carrying that entire hoard and buried the disc after it had already lived a long life. It was not new. It was old, used, and altered more than once. It reads less like a tool than like a dead authority. If that is what happened, the Nebra Sky Disk is more than an image of the heavens. It shows Bronze Age people in Central Europe reworking knowledge across generations, fixing it into metal, tying it to ceremony, and then deliberately taking it out of circulation. The disc was not made in a single statement. The museum's reconstruction gives it 5 phases. First came the original image, 32 stars, a full moon or sun, and a crescent moon. Later, 2 horizon arcs were added at the sides. Later still, a curved gold band like a boat appeared below. Then a ring of perforations was punched around the rim. At some point, 1 horizon arc was removed. X-rays and the metal itself support that sequence. Some gold elements differ in silver content from others. They did not all come from the same moment of manufacture. This is a revised sky, a cosmology with an update history. An object that keeps changing does not preserve one message. It preserves several, layered over each other. This is no longer a map in the modern sense. It is a ritual surface whose meaning shifted as the people handling it changed. The curse here is forensic, not supernatural. What makes the disc extraordinary also makes it slippery. Every phase preserves knowledge. Every phase overwrites knowledge too. So archaeologists had to work backward from damage. After the Basel seizure, they went back to Middelburg and tested the looter's story against the hill, the soil, and the associated objects. The whole case depends on whether the disc truly belongs with that hoard. The swords, axes, spirals, and chisel anchor the context in the early Bronze Age. If the disc was buried with them, the dating hardens. If it was not, the floor drops away. Years later, that became the center of the fight. In 2020, a challenge argued that the disc might not be early Bronze Age at all. Maybe it was around 1,000 years younger. Maybe it did not originally belong to the hoard. Maybe the looted context had contaminated the entire interpretation. Officially, the State Museum and UNESCO reject that. Their position is that the Bronze Age context is secure, supported by the reconstructed find circumstances and by the associated objects. But once provenance is poisoned, certainty never sounds clean again. You can document soil traces. You can compare corrosion. You can rebuild the object's movement through the market. You cannot unloot a site. Sometimes knowledge is lost, not because ancient people hid it well, but because modern hands break the chain that explains what it was. There is another reason Middelburg matters. Stand there today near the observation tower and look toward the Brocken. The line of sight marks the summer solstice sunset. That does not prove every interpretation attached to the disc. It does tie the object to a specific landscape. The sky on the bronze may have been portable. The knowledge behind it may not have been. It may have belonged to a hill, a horizon, a season, and a group of people who knew exactly where to stand when the light went down. Lose the place, and part of the meaning goes with it. Loot the place, and you lose the check against fantasy. Even the metal keeps that tension alive. In 2024, metallographic work argued that the disc was not simply cast as a thin plate. It was forged from a cast preform, worked down into that improbable shape before the gold was applied. This was not crude improvisation. It required control, repeated hammering, and technical judgment. Somebody knew how to make a bronze surface broad, thin, and stable enough to carry a symbolic program that would later be modified. Whatever the disc means, it came out of a craft tradition already mature enough to build it. The object looks singular. The knowledge behind it probably was not. The more solid that picture becomes, the stranger the burial looks. If the official reading holds, someone took an already ancient, repeatedly revised object and buried it with weapons and ornaments near a summit instead of passing it on. Not displayed, not recycled, removed. A working body of knowledge was condensed into bronze, then sealed underground. No lightning, no curse, just a decision. That is how systems vanish, not all at once. One keeper dies, one ritual stops, one object is retired. Then, centuries later, two men with illegal detectors tear into the hill. The only surviving witness comes back into daylight, carrying fresh scars from a modern shovel. So the Nebra Sky Disk sits in an uneasy place. Officially, it is an early Bronze Age object buried around 1600 BC, recovered from a looted hoard, but still anchored by the evidence around it. Unofficially, the argument never fully sleeps, because the first act in its modern biography was a crime, and crime leaves behind alternate timelines. If the disk is exactly what the museum says, it preserves a sky that people in Bronze Age Europe did not just observe, but revise and finally lay to rest. If the critics are right, one of archaeology's most famous windows into prehistoric knowledge was assembled from contaminated context and wishful reading. Either way, the damage was done before science arrived. What lingers is not the gold stars or the crescent. It is a thin bronze circle under a German hill for more than 3.5 millennia, carrying a version of the sky that may once have told people when to look, where to stand, and what season had arrived. Then the knowledge was buried, the hill went quiet, only the sunset stayed above it. Number 7. Ulfberht swords. In 2008, inside the Wallace Collection in London, a private collector laid a Viking Age blade on a table and expected confirmation. The name in the iron was famous enough to do most of the talking by itself, plus ULFBERH+T, or something very close to it. For more than a century, that inscription had carried the aura of an elite weapon, the kind of sword people imagine in the hands of a chieftain or a king's retainer. But archaeometallurgist Alan Williams was not looking at legend. He was looking at metal. Metal has a way of embarrassing stories. The strangest part is the carbon content in the best examples, around 1.2% carbon. In one Hamburg museum sword, about 1.2%. In an Oslo example, roughly 1.2 to 1.4%. That is not ordinary bloomery iron, cleaned up by a talented smith. That is steel in a range so high, and often so low in slag, that in early medieval Europe it looks almost out of place. That is the shock inside the inscription. Some Ulfberht swords were made from material that seems to arrive centuries too early for the neighborhood. The document that matters here is not a saga or a monastery chronicle. It is a lab record. Williams, working with Tony Fry at the National Physical Laboratory, compared Viking Age blades by what they actually were under the surface. Across a metallurgical study of 44 specimens from Ulfberht and related swords, the famous names split in two. In one group of 14 correctly spelled Ulfberht swords, 9 turned out to be hypereutectoid or partly hypereutectoid steel. Not all. 9. Enough to show a pattern, not enough to make the mystery comfortable. The trap was in the branding. Two swords could look almost identical. Same long blade. Same prestige name hammered into the fuller, same promise hanging at a warrior's side. But one might be made from unusually refined, high-carbon steel linked to imported crucible material moving through the Baltic to Iran trade network in the 9th to 11th centuries. The other might be made from local European iron, dressed up with a copied inscription and sold on reputation. In a market without certificates, serial numbers, or spectroscopy, the buyer had one real test. Combat. Picture the moment. Cold light on a riverbank or the edge of a field, around the year 950. Your sword is expensive. It carries the right name. It may have traveled hundreds of miles to reach you. But you do not know whether you bought the real thing or a counterfeit until it slams into another blade, or bites a shield rim and tells the truth all at once. Not in a workshop. Not in a dispute over price. In the moment you need it not to fail. There is no magical curse here. There is a forensic one. The inscription that should identify the object is the reason the object becomes unreliable. The name does not solve the case. The name creates it. By 1991, Alfred Geibig's survey had identified 122 Ulfberht examples, or fragments. This is not one miraculous outlier dug from one lucky grave. It is a population spread across northern Europe, mainly from the 9th through 11th centuries, all orbiting the same inlaid word. More specimens should have made the answer clearer. The opposite happened. The larger the group became, the less certain Ulfberht looked as a person. Was it a single master smith? A workshop in the Rhineland? A family tradition passed across generations? A Frankish product line that became so prestigious, other makers started cloning it. Science can separate high-carbon steel from lower-grade imitations. It can read slag content, microstructure, heat treatment. It can tell you that spelling matters, because the more regular plus VLFBERH plus T group appears to correlate more often with the unusual metallurgy, while variant spellings often do not. But the central figure in the story only gets blurrier. The more precisely we read the blade, the less securely we can name the hand behind it. Beneath all of this sits a larger problem. Why does hard-won knowledge that took generations to master vanish without a trace? And who benefits when it does? Ulfberht shows what that loss looks like inside a supply chain. Someone, somewhere, knew how to obtain or work steel that much of Europe could not reliably produce. Someone knew routes, suppliers, furnace traditions, carbon control, trade contacts stretching eastward toward crucible steel zones. Those links were fragile. They depended on movement, on merchants, on political stability, on rivers and Baltic ports, on demand that stayed profitable. When that network weakened, the material signature began to fade. Not overnight. That is almost never how knowledge dies. First, the genuine steel becomes harder to source. Then the prestige remains even as the substance thins out. Then the name starts doing more work than the craft. People miss that part. A lost technology does not always disappear into silence. Sometimes it survives as a label attached to worse copies. The word remains. The method goes missing. These swords sit in an uneasy place between artifact and warning. They are famous because the best of them seem impossibly advanced. They are dangerous because the fame itself created a market for deception. A warrior did not just need strength or status, he needed authentication. In the Viking Age, authentication meant trusting an inlaid name that counterfeiters had every reason to imitate. Even the modern afterlife of the story follows the same pattern. On October 10, 2012, Nova aired Secrets of the Viking Sword, 52 minutes and 53 seconds built around the allure of Ulfberht. The public version becomes a tale of a near-mythic blade. The lab version is harsher. Some were remarkable, some were not. Some may have carried imported crucible steel into Northern Europe. Some may have carried only the reputation of that steel, and nothing else. A surviving fragment sold privately, dated to around 950, preserves just 18 1/8 inches of blade, 46 centimeters, less than half a sword, and still enough to keep the argument alive. The mystery is no longer whether Ulfberht existed as a word. It did. The mystery is whether the word ever belonged to one man at all, or whether it was already a medieval trademark war, stamped into iron. That is, the sting in the evidence from London in 2008. The collector did not bring in one sword. He brought in a confession from the object itself. Same name, different metal. The inscription was not a guarantee. It was a gamble. Some Ulfberht swords were masterpieces. Some were fakes. Number 6. Lycurgus Cup. You're holding it near a window. It fits in two hands, just 158.8 millimeters tall, about 132 across at its widest point, roughly 700 grams. Not huge, not theatrical. Then you turn it. From the front, in reflected daylight, it looks green, murky green, almost olive. Move the light behind it, and the same vessel burns ruby red, as if someone swapped the object while you blinked. No gears, no hidden panels, just glass, supposedly. That single word opens the whole problem. Somewhere in the late Roman world, in the 4th century AD, an elite workshop made this thing. We do not know the city. We do not know the furnace. We do not know the name of the craftsperson who got it right. But they carved the vessel into a cage cup, one of the rarest luxuries Rome ever produced. Maybe 50 to 100 Roman cage cups survive at all. None is quite like this one. Around the bowl runs a violent little scene. King Lycurgus is trapped in vines. Dionysus stands over him. Followers close in. The king is defeated, then overtaken, wrapped, punished by a god. It is myth cut into open-work glass so fine it already looks impossible, even before the color shift begins. Then the cup vanishes. The first curse is not death or rumor. It is loss. A masterpiece is made in one of the most technically capable societies on Earth. And then the trail snaps. No secure excavation, no recorded tomb, No ancient inventory you can point to and say, there, that's the cup. Its find spot is still unknown. A Roman workshop solved a problem most later viewers could barely describe, and the knowledge slipped out of the record. The object stayed behind like a taunt. The cup surfaces again, only in print, in 1845. That leaves a gap of roughly 15 centuries. One drinking vessel carries a hidden technology across empire collapse, medieval recycling, looting, private collecting, and silence. Soon after, it enters the Rothschild collection. Now the artifact is visible again. But seeing a thing is not the same as understanding it. That happened here. In 1950, Lord Rothschild asked two serious scholars, D.B. Harden and J.M.C. Toynbee, to examine it. A Roman cup seemed to switch from green to blood red, depending on the light, so experts were called in. The effect was so strange that there was real debate over whether it was glass at all. Not whether it was unusually made glass, whether it was glass, period. Roman glass is supposed to behave like Roman glass. Transparent or colored, yes. Elegant, yes. Cut and carved, absolutely. But not this. Not one object showing two different faces, depending on whether light bounces off it or passes through it. That feels less like decoration and more like a trick. Later generations call it mystical, when they have simply lost the recipe. So the British Museum's Dr. G.F. Claringbull got involved from the natural history side. By then, the question had drifted away from art history and toward materials science. What exactly is this substance? Claringbull concluded that yes, it was glass. Then, in 1959, X-ray diffraction backed that up. Case closed, sort of. The cup was not stone, not crystal, not some misidentified composite. It was glass. That made the puzzle sharper. If it was glass, Roman glass, then Roman craftspeople had made a vessel with optical behavior that looked absurdly modern. Not in a poetic sense, in a measurable one, in a repeatable one, in one lighting condition, greenish in reflection, in another, translucent ruby in transmission. Same object, same walls. Different physics depending on how the light moves through it. In 1958, before that full scientific trail played out, the British Museum acquired it from Victor, the third Lord Rothschild. Total cost, £20,000, with a £2,000 art fund grant helping seal the deal. In the museum register, it became object number 1958-1202.1, a neat institutional label for something that had spent centuries refusing to stay pinned down. There was another complication. Parts of what you see are not Roman. The silver gilt foot and rim are thought to be 18th or 19th century additions, probably attached after earlier damage. So the cup carries a disguise, ancient core, later repairs, a Roman marvel wearing a modern suit. That matters because bad restoration can produce good myths. People see one strange object and assume every strange detail belongs to the original maker. Here, some of it does not. The central effect does. That became clear later, when electron microscopy got close enough to expose the mechanism inside the glass itself. At that point, the story stops sounding like folklore and starts sounding like lab work. Inside the glass are metal particles, tiny ones, typically about 50 to 100 nanometers across. These are not visible flecks or decorative glitter. This is structure at a scale where light behaves differently because of what it meets. The particles are not random junk either. They are a silver-gold alloy, roughly 7 parts silver to 3 parts gold, with around 10% copper mixed in. That is the trick, not magic, not a coating, not dye painted onto the surface. Nanoparticles embedded in the glass with extraordinary control. Light reflected from the cup produces one visual effect. Light transmitted through it produces another. Green one way, red the other. The curse, if you want to call it that, was a materials recipe hiding in plain sight for more than 1,500 years. So now the mechanism sounds solved, only if you stop one layer too early. Science can explain the color shift. It can show you the particles. It can measure their size. It can estimate the alloy. It can tell you why the cup behaves the way it does. What it still cannot fully prove is whether Roman makers intended this exact effect as a deliberate, repeatable recipe, or whether a highly specialized workshop hit a narrow window by combining heat treatment, impurities, and metal chemistry in just the right way. That difference matters. These are two different histories. In one, Roman artisans understood enough to engineer a controlled optical effect that looks uncannily like nanotechnology. In the other, they achieved one astonishing success at the edge of their practice, and the exact path to making it died with the workshop. Either way, the pattern is familiar. Skill builds over generations. One object survives. The method does not. Whoever controlled that method, court workshop, imperial patron, or luxury trade network, controlled something more valuable than the cup itself. There may even be politics in the image. Harden and Toynbee suggested the scene of Dionysus overcoming Lycurgus could allude to Constantine's defeat of Licinius in AD 324. If they are right, this was not just luxury tableware. It was propaganda you could drink from. A color-shifting imperial statement, green in one light, red in another. Myth on the surface, power underneath. So what remains as a Roman object rare even among rarities, technically baffling even after explanation, and historically homeless? We know what it does. We know, broadly, how it does it. But we still do not know where it was made, how often that feat could be repeated, or whether the people who made it fully grasped the optical miracle trapped in the glass. The object survived. The chain of mastery did not. As one modern description puts it, it is green in reflected light and red in transmitted light. Number 5. Voynich Manuscript. In 1912, Wilfrid Voynich stood in a Jesuit collection at Frascati, near Rome, and turned over a small vellum codex no bigger than 225 by 160 millimeters. A modest thing, roughly the size of a hand, about 102 folios, one extra paper flyleaf, brown ink, faded paint. It should have behaved like any other manuscript dealers find. Date it by script, place it by decoration, match the plants, follow the language, sell the story with the object. Then he opened it, and the book stopped cooperating. Every page offered evidence. None of it lined up. There were plants, but not plants anyone could securely name. More than 100 of them. 113 in Yale's catalog. Each one looked less like a botanical drawing than a memory of one. There were circular diagrams packed with stars and bands and little compartments, like astronomy redrawn from a fever dream. There were naked women, dozens of them, standing in green pools or crowding through linked tubes that looked part plumbing, part anatomy, part ritual. Under all of it ran line after line of writing and characters no alphabet book could place. Voynich was not a tourist stumbling onto a curiosity. He dealt in rare books for a living. He knew what a forgery usually looked like. He knew what a puzzle looked like too. This was worse. The script repeated with the confidence of real writing. The pages were planned. Sections opened and closed in patterns. Paragraphs began with larger symbols, as if the book understood its own rules. It looked less like nonsense than like something written for readers who were no longer in the room. He kept turning pages. One folio gave him root systems and leaves attached to impossible stems. Another folded out into a larger chart, circles nested inside circles, tiny stars pricking the parchment like marks on a machine with no instructions. Then, another page swarmed with text, dense and even, each line laid down without visible hesitation. Not one correction that solved anything. Not one gloss in a known hand to rescue the reader. You can almost see the dealer's instinct split in two. Half of him sees value, the other half sees a trap. Tucked with the codex was the one thing that should have made it easier. A letter, dated 1666, written by Johannes Marcus Marci to Athanasius Kircher. Two real men, two known names. Marci, a scholar in Prague. Kircher, the Jesuit polymath in Rome, famous for claiming he could crack old mysteries. The letter said the manuscript had once belonged to Emperor Rudolph II, that Rudolph had paid 600 gold ducats for it, that he believed it was the work of Roger Bacon. In a few lines, the little book reached into imperial Prague. The letter did not decode a single word. It sharpened the mystery. Picture Voynich holding both objects together. In one hand, a manuscript that looked scientific, magical, medical, astronomical, and fully committed to none of them. In the other, a 1666 note forwarding it to the one man in Europe who might have been expected to read the unreadable. Marci was effectively saying, "I cannot do this. Perhaps you can." Kircher, for all his reputation, left no translation behind that anyone accepts. If he solved it, the solution vanished. If he failed, the failure entered the archive with the book and stayed there. The codex slid into Jesuit custody and disappeared from the public story. Not burned, not denounced, just shelved. Hidden in plain sight among other volumes. While centuries passed over it, empires moved, libraries changed hands. The people who might have explained the script died, and the script remained where parchment survives best. Closed, quiet, materially ordinary. No thunderclap around the Voynich Manuscript. No dramatic curse. No obvious fraud exposed under lamplight. Just a document that keeps its body intact, while its meaning refuses to come with it. When Voynich brought it back into circulation in 1912, the performance began again. Scholars came at it from every side. Botanists tried the plants, astronomers tried the stars, cryptographers attacked the script as code. Linguists counted repeated forms and positional habits. The text kept answering yes and no at the same time. Yes, it behaves like language in some ways. No, not enough. Yes, there are patterns. No, not patterns anyone can read. The book looked designed to yield under pressure. It never did. The physical object kept insisting on its own reality. In 1969, after passing through the hands of dealer H.P. Krauss, the manuscript entered Yale's Beinecke Library. By then, the codex had a permanent home. Controlled light, controlled temperature, a call number, a box, a reading room. No more rumors about whether it existed. There it was, folio after folio. A medieval object you could measure, photograph, and test. If the easy answer was modern forgery, science had a chance to catch it. Instead, in 2009, University of Arizona physicist Greg Hodgins took 4 tiny samples from the parchment margins. 4 cuts. Small enough to spare the page, decisive enough to anchor the skin in time. The result came back 1404 to 1438, early 15th century. Real medieval vellum, not 19th century theater, not a prank assembled for collectors in Voynich's day. The animal skin itself belonged to the world the manuscript seemed to imitate. Now the room changes again. This is not a clever modern fake dressed up as an old book. It is an actual medieval manuscript, made on actual medieval parchment, using pigments consistent with a Renaissance palette, carrying nearly 37,919 words, in a script still unmatched to any confirmed language. Some manuscript specialists have argued the writing shows not one hand, but several, as many as 5 scribes. 5 people, potentially, moving through the same system. 5 sets of habits. 5 trained hands copying marks that still do not open. Picture the table. Voynich under lamplight in 1912. The codex open. Marcy's 1666 letter beside it. Prague in the background. Kircher waiting at the far end of the chain. Then another room 5 centuries earlier. Quieter, closer, where one scribe writes a line and another takes over. Then another, each one perfectly at home inside an alphabet that has outlived every key to itself. Voynich turns another page. More roots, more stars, more women climbing through green vessels, more text marching in neat rows toward the lower margin. He has a real book in his hands, a real date range, a real paper trail, maybe even a real workshop behind it. Somewhere, someone read this with ease. The page does not help him, it just waits. Number 4. Shroud of Turin. On May 28, 1898, Secundo Pia stood inside Turin Cathedral with a camera, glass plates, and a problem he did not expect to create. The Shroud of Turin had already been in the city for 320 years, folded and guarded and argued over. It was a linen cloth about 4.30 meters long and 1.08 meters wide, marked with the faint front and back image of a crucified man. Pia was not a priest or a famous physicist. He was a lawyer and an amateur photographer. That night, he was trying to do something that sounded almost dull, document a relic during a public exposition. Photography in 1898 was not point and shoot. It was chemistry, timing, darkness, and luck. You exposed the plate. You carried it into the darkroom. You waited while the image rose in the tray. In that room, Pia's life crossed one of the strangest turns in the history of any artifact on Earth. The cloth itself looks washed out. The figure is faint. You have to work to see it. But when Pia developed the negative, the face sharpened instead of fading. The photographic negative looked more like a positive portrait than the object hanging in front of him. Eyes closed, nose clear, beard defined. In a single development tray, the shroud stopped being only a medieval relic on display to pilgrims. It became an optical trap, a thing that seemed to hide information until technology pulled it out. The shroud had never been simple, not before Pia, not even close. Its first secure appearance comes in the 1350s in Lire, France, tied to the family of the knight Geoffroy de Charny. Pilgrims came, money came with them. Almost immediately, accusations came too. By around 1389, Pierre d'Arcy, Bishop of Troyes, was writing to Pope Clement VII to warn that the cloth was being promoted as Christ's burial shroud, when, in his view, it was a fraud. Not a quiet fraud, a public one, a profitable one, a relic with an audience. The fight around the shroud did not begin as science versus faith. It began as authority versus authority. Churchmen argued over relic economics, clerical credibility, and who controlled a miracle once crowds started forming around it. Modern retellings often flatten that part. Pia did not walk into a peaceful devotional object and disturb it with a camera. He entered a dispute already more than 500 years old. Still, his photograph changed the terms of the fight. Once the negative circulated, the shroud stopped behaving like an ordinary relic. It became evidence, or at least it looked like evidence. Newspapers could print it, lecturers could point to it, believers could say the image contained hidden visual information no medieval artist would have understood. Skeptics could answer with the same image and say the opposite. If a trick was involved, this was exactly the kind of effect that made the trick powerful. One photograph fed both sides. Every attempt to settle the object gave it a new life. Pia felt the shock first. Some accounts say he worried he had made a mistake, that the plate had somehow gone wrong, because what appeared in the darkroom looked too dramatic to trust at first glance. Picture the room: red light, wet chemicals, a ghostly face surfacing where he expected a dull record shot. He was not discovering a body. He was discovering that an image on cloth behaved more like a photographic negative than it had any right to. From that instant, the argument was no longer medieval. It was modern. It was reproducible. It could be carried in a briefcase. The next century did what the modern world does to a mystery that refuses to die. It measured it. In 1978, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, STURP, spent days examining the cloth in Turin with non-destructive tests. Chemists, physicists, imaging specialists, ultraviolet fluorescence, X-radiography, sticky tape sampling, the kind of technical assault that usually strips an object of its aura. Some ordinary explanations did weaken. Later summaries of the work reported no simple paint or pigment mechanism for the body image. That did not prove a miracle. It did remove the easiest exit. Instead of narrowing the field, that widened it. Once just painted becomes harder to defend, the artifact gets stranger, not safer. Now you need a medieval process capable of producing an image so superficial, so faint, and so tonally inverted that a 19th century negative makes it look more legible than the cloth itself. The shape of the problem changed. The problem did not. The shroud kept doing the same thing to every generation, turning confidence into a temporary condition. Then came the date. In 1988, samples were tested by laboratories in Arizona, Oxford, and Zurich. The result, published in Nature in 1989, placed the cloth at AD 1260 to 1390 with 95% confidence. Medieval, squarely medieval. Not first century Jerusalem, not a relic from the time of Christ, at least according to the most famous measurement ever made on it. Officially, that should have been the end. It matched the object's emergence in the historical record almost too neatly. The shroud appears in the 1350s. The carbon date points to the same broad world. Case closed. File it beside every other ingenious medieval fabrication that drew pilgrims and income. On the ground, that is not what happened. The date answered one question and left the image behind. If the laboratories were broadly right, the central mystery did not disappear. It moved. The problem became harder in a different way. What medieval workshop, using what process, made an image that still resists a plain forgery story? That pressure has not eased. In 2025, historian Nicolas Sarzeau published work identifying an even earlier medieval rejection of the shroud, from within Nicole Oresme's lifetime, somewhere between 1355 and 1382. The skepticism is older than many defenders like to imagine. The object was controversial almost from birth. That sharpens the edge. A likely medieval origin explains the century, not the method. That is where Secundo Pia still matters. He did not prove the shroud authentic. He did not disprove it either. He did something worse for anyone who wanted closure. He converted a relic into a machine for generating new uncertainty. Before 1898, you could fight about devotion, fraud, and pilgrimage. After 1898, you had an image that seemed to withhold itself until modern technology intervened, as if the cloth had been waiting for chemistry to unlock its next layer. For a story about lost knowledge, that is the sting. Sometimes the knowledge does not vanish because nobody cared to preserve it. Sometimes it vanishes because the thing that carried it was built to survive the verdict and outlive the method. Officially, the shroud is a medieval cloth dated by 3 laboratories. On the ground, it is still the same trap that caught Secundo Pia in his darkroom, an object declared solved and somehow not finished. Too dramatic to trust at first glance. Number 3. Hope Diamond. On November 10, 1958, letter carrier James G. Todd carried a plain brown package into the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Inside was one of the most famous diamonds on Earth, 45.52 carats, deep blue, valued for mailing purposes at $1 million. The postage was $2.44. The insurance cost $142.85. Harry Winston had mailed it by registered first-class mail 2 days earlier, on November 8th. It was wrapped so plainly that the whole transfer felt less like a royal handoff and more like a clerical mistake. Cameras were waiting for Todd at the museum, and by his own account, he was shaking. Not because of a curse, because all of America was watching a mailman carry a legend in his hands. That legend is the part everybody remembers. The Hope Diamond kills its owners. It ruins families. It crosses oceans trailing suicides, drownings, bankruptcies, and disaster. Strip that story down to evidence, and the mechanism looks much less supernatural. It looks deliberate. Not an ancient curse whispered in a mine, but a modern product built piece by piece from a real theft, a damaged paper trail, a few convenient deaths, and one very marketable idea. Start with the stone itself, not the myth, the chemistry. The Hope is a Type 2B diamond, an extremely rare class whose blue color comes from traces of boron in the crystal lattice. Under shortwave ultraviolet light, it does something stranger still. It glows red. Strong phosphorescence lingers after the lamp goes dark. That sounds like the kind of detail ghost stories feed on. Here, it is measurable. Weight, color, cut, optical behavior. The curse leaves nothing you can test. The stone does. Now run the numbers backward. In 1974, when the Hope was removed from its setting and examined directly, its weight was confirmed at 45.52 carats. Go back to London in 1812. A deep blue stone in dealer Daniel Eliason's hands was described by John Francilian as 177 grains, or 44.25 carats. Close enough to draw attention, not enough to prove identity on its own. Keep going. In 1673, under Louis XIV, a much larger blue diamond was recut into the 67 1/8 carat French blue. Go back further, and the trail reaches a rougher ancestor, the Tavernier stone, 112 3/16 carats, probably mined near Kalur in the Golconda region of India. The first hard fact is size. One blue diamond at 112 3/16 carats becomes another at 67 1/8. Then, after a violent break in the record, a smaller deep blue stone appears at about 44 1/4, and the modern Hope settles at 45.52. That is the profile of a gemstone being cut, recut, and disguised. That break matters. In September 1792, Paris was tearing down its monarchy by force. During a week-long looting of the royal storehouse, thieves broke into the French crown jewels and carried off the French blue. That is the clean historical split. Before it, the stone belongs to the French crown. After it, the record shatters. No tidy receipt, no neat chain of custody, just absence. 20 years later, in 1812, a smaller blue diamond surfaces in London. The timing is hard to ignore. A stolen royal gem becomes easier to move after it has been altered enough to stop looking like the royal gem everyone is searching for. The mystery sits there, in the paperwork. The cursed version of the story claims a continuity it cannot prove. It wants one uninterrupted, blood-soaked line, from India to Paris, to London, to America. The documented line does not give it that. It has a hole in the middle large enough to carry the whole legend. We do not know exactly who possessed the stone between the 1792 theft and the 1812 London appearance. GIA research, including lead-cast modeling of the old French blue, strongly supports the idea that the hope is what remained after that larger stone was recut. The shape fits, the dimensions fit, the historical incentive fits, but the chain of custody still does not close. So, when does the curse show up? Not in the court of Louis XIV, not in the 1792 theft records, not in some ancient Indian warning attached to the stone's past. The popular curse is much newer and much easier to explain. In 1908, American newspapers began calling the diamond a hoodoo. In 1909, one of the best-known curse stories arrived fully formed and partly false. A report that former owner Salim Habib had drowned with the diamond. Smithsonian's history is blunt. The report was wrong. Habib no longer owned the stone. The hope was not on the ship. One of the curse's marquee victims was, effectively, a media ghost. That detail matters. The most famous evidence for the curse was not evidence of the curse. It was evidence that newspapers had found a better story than the truth. Then Pierre Cartier saw exactly what that story could do. By the time he was courting Evelyn Walsh McLean, the Washington heiress and socialite, the diamond needed more than rarity. Rarity gets attention. A curse gets fixation. McLean eventually bought it for $180,000 after Cartier's long campaign. Then she did what marketers dream of and rarely get to control. She turned the jewel into a public personality. She wore it constantly. She made it her signature. Photographs spread. Gossip moved faster. Later, tragedy struck her family, and the sales pitch hardened into folklore. Look closely at the mechanism. A diamond with a vague gap in provenance becomes a diamond with a narrative. A narrative needs victims. Ordinary human catastrophes are gathered around the stone and made to look like emissions from it. The diamond did not create the deaths. The story rearranged them. That is why this object belongs on a list like this. Not because the science breaks down. Here, science works unusually well. It can classify the stone, explain the blue through boron, document the red phosphorescence, track the recutting problem, compare weights across centuries, and narrow the path from the French blue to the modern hope. But the thing people think they know about the Hope Diamond is not the chemistry. It is the curse. The curse survives because it is built around a gap science still cannot fully close. Those missing years after 1792, when a crown jewel vanished into criminal hands and returned smaller. You can watch the fabrication build backward. First, a real theft, then silence, then a suspiciously altered stone. Then, a century later, journalism adds doom, salesmanship adds personality, tragedy adds confirmation. By the time the diamond reaches the Smithsonian in a registered mail sack, the supernatural version is doing more work than the historical one. So what is the Hope Diamond, on the evidence? A rare boron blue diamond, probably born in India, transformed at least twice by human cutting, stolen with the French crown jewels in September 1792, almost certainly recut to conceal its identity, and later wrapped in a curse that was profitable because it was unverifiable. The famous mystery is not why bad things happen near it. Bad things happen near everything, if the sample is rich enough and the headlines are hungry enough. The mystery is who handled the stone in those missing 20 years, who ordered the recut, and who first understood that the cleanest way to hide a jewel's past was to bury it under a better story. By the time James G. Todd set that package down in Washington, the diamond had crossed from royal treasure to tabloid weapon to museum specimen. Under the glass, the stone is still. The gap is what still moves. Number 2. Tutankhamun's Death Mask. In August 2014, inside the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, staff handling object JE60672 snapped off a beard that had already been reattached once before, in 1946. It did not stay off for long. Someone reached for epoxy. When conservators examined the damage in 2015, the repair line was obvious. Adhesive had spread beyond the join. A 9-week restoration had to reverse a modern mistake on one of the most studied objects on Earth. Start with that residue, not priests or curses, a failed bond between gold and resin. Line up the dates and the legend starts to slip. Egypt's most famous cursed object was not even part of the story when the curse was born. Take the object itself. It is 54 centimeters high, 39.3 centimeters wide. It weighs 10.23 kilograms. Gold, quartz, obsidian, colored glass, and lapis-toned inlay form a human face built for a practical task. Around 1323 BCE, when Tutankhamun died young and was buried in tomb KV62, this mask covered the head and shoulders of the mummy. It let the dead king be recognized in the afterlife as a divine body, not a decaying one. Precision mattered here. Identity mattered. The face had to survive death. The numbers behind the curse come much later. On November 4, 1922, Howard Carter's team found the staircase cut into the Valley of the Kings. On February 17, 1923, one key sealed threshold was broken. A British medical journal study later treated that moment as one of the measurable points of exposure to Tutankhamun's tomb. 44 Westerners were identified in that cohort. 25 were classed as exposed. Clean numbers, a testable claim. If a curse kills, the death should bunch around contact. If it does not, the pattern should fall apart. Then came the death that powered the whole story. April 5, 1923. George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, Carter's patron, died in Cairo after an infected mosquito bite led to blood poisoning and pneumonia. He was 56. Newspapers took over from there. A wealthy English lord helps open a pharaoh's tomb, then dies weeks later. That is not evidence. It is perfect copy. The mummy's curse did not need statistics. It needed order. Tomb, seal, death, print. Now set one more date beside those three. October 28, 1925. Carter wrote in his journal about the unveiling of Tutankhamun's mummy. That is the first record in his notes of the gold mask over the king's head. 2 years and nearly 6 months after Carnarvon died. The object now treated as the face of the curse was absent from the public story when the curse exploded across headlines. The emblem came after the fear. That gap matters. Legends cling to the most photogenic surviving thing, not the first thing involved. A staircase is not iconic. A mosquito bite is not iconic. A chain of medical complications is not iconic. A 10.23 kilogram gold face with inlaid eyes is. So, the mask turned into retroactive evidence, not because it killed anyone, because it looked like it should have. The BMJ paper cut through that with a dry, forensic method. 44 Westerners, 25 exposed to the supposed danger point. No significant difference in survival. No concentrated wave of death among those who entered the tomb. Measured against actual lifespans, the curse failed. In culture, it did not. The myth kept growing because it solved a different problem. It gave random illness a script. It gave the press a villain with a face. Look closely at the object, and the anomaly is historical, not supernatural. Some scholars have argued that the mask may not have been made originally for Tutankhamun. The clues are small, but they accumulate. Altered cartouches, pierced ears, unusual on a pharaoh's funerary mask if the final owner was shown strictly as an adult male king. Possible differences in gold and alloy work between parts of the object. Those details have led to a debated idea. The mask, or parts of its original design, may have been adapted from equipment intended for another royal figure, perhaps Neferuaten, perhaps even Nefertiti. It is not proven, it is not settled, but the possibility is there in the metal. Now the dates pull in another direction. 1323 BCE for the burial, 1922 for the staircase, 1923 for the death that birthed the curse, 1925 for the first documented mention of the mask, 1946 for an earlier beard reattachment, 2014 for the botched epoxy fix, 2015 for the 9-week restoration that exposed it. Each date removes a layer of inevitability. This object was not carrying one seamless supernatural history. It was accumulating stories, repairs, identities, and uses across more than 3,300 years. A pattern from this video shows up here again. Why does hard-won knowledge that took generations to master vanish without a trace? And who benefits when it does? In this case, the missing thing may be workshop knowledge. If the mask was adapted from another royal burial set, then between one reign and the next, specialists had to alter names, fit sacred equipment to a new body, and preserve enough continuity for the final object to keep working ritually. Those goldsmiths knew exactly how to change identity without destroying authority. Their names are gone. Their sequence is barely visible. The tabloids remembered the mosquito. There is one more twist in the beard story. The 2014 accident looked like a single catastrophe at first. It was not. The later restoration showed that the beard had already been detached and reattached decades earlier, in 1946. Even the new curse sat on top of an older repair history hidden inside the object itself. What looked like sudden desecration was partly rediscovered damage. The mask was not pristine until modern hands ruined it. It had already been handled, broken, and altered, then passed forward as if untouched. That is the forensic picture. JE60672 is 54 centimeters of gold certainty, wrapped around layers of uncertainty. The mortality data do not support a curse. The chronology cuts the mask loose from Carnarvon's death. The conservation record shows repeated human error, not supernatural retaliation. And the unresolved design clues leave open the possibility that the king's most famous face began as someone else's. The mask meant to guarantee identity may itself be a reuse. Number 1. Antikythera Mechanism. In spring 1900, off the rocky coast of Antikythera, Captain Dimitrios Kontos sent a sponge diver named Elias Stadiatis down through roughly 45 to 55 meters of water in a heavy canvas suit and copper helmet. The crew had ducked in there to escape a storm. They expected sponges. Stadiatis surfaced shaken and said the seabed was covered with dead bodies. They were not bodies. They were bronze and marble statues, scattered around a wreck from about 70 BCE. So the divers kept going down. The cost came fast. Georgios Kritikos died of decompression sickness. 2 other divers were left paralyzed. The sea gave up masterpieces and took men with them. Among the statues, glassware, and luxury cargo was one object nobody would have fought over on deck, a corroded lump of bronze and wood. No face, no inscription visible at a glance. No beauty, just a crusted mass dragged up from a grave on the seafloor and sent with the rest to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. Then in 1902, Valerio Staius looked closer. Inside the corrosion, he saw gear teeth. That changed everything. If Staius was seeing a real mechanism, then a machine from the 2nd or early 1st century BCE did not fit the ancient world as we had pictured it. Not because the Greeks lacked intelligence, because this was precision work. Interlocking toothed wheels, astronomical cycles compressed into bronze, a handheld cosmos. History had placed this kind of thing at least 1,000 years later. Start with the number that stops the room. 30 surviving bronze gears. Not decorative rings, not loose fittings, gears. Once the teeth are visible, that evidence does not go away. There are 82 surviving fragments in all. What we have is not the machine itself. It is the wreckage of the machine. Even broken apart, it is enough to force a hard possibility. Maybe this was not a one-off miracle built by one impossible genius. Maybe it came out of workshop knowledge. If so, the consequences are practical. Ancient craftsmen would have had methods for cutting precise gear teeth, choosing tooth counts, laying out compound trains, engraving technical instructions, and casing the whole thing into a device a person could use. They would also have needed to teach the next pair of hands to do it again. Not once, reliably. A machine like this is not just an idea. It lives or dies on tolerances. Ratios have to mesh in metal. Design has to survive manufacture. That matters because lone brilliance can die with one man. Workshop knowledge disappears in another way. It leaves holes where industry should be. By the time modern imaging reached the fragments in 2005 and 2006, the mechanism had already spent a century taunting everyone who studied it. X-rays had shown complexity before. CT scanning and surface imaging pulled words and structures out of the corrosion itself. Hidden inscriptions, buried gear trains, text that functioned partly as a user manual, not poetry, not philosophy, operating information. It described displays, calendars, cycles of the sun and moon, and eclipse data. Picture the device in your hands. On the back, the upper dial tracked a 19-year metonic calendar on a 5-turn spiral. Below it, another spiral counted 223 lunar months, the Saros cycle used to predict eclipses. This was not a trinket pretending to be scientific. It was astronomy made mechanical. Turn a handle, and relationships in the sky move through bronze ratios in your hand. The shock is also in the method. Modern reconstructions, including the UCL work in 2021, point to planetary cycles chosen because they could actually be built. Venus with a 462-year cycle, Saturn with 442 years, accurate enough to matter, but also manufacturable enough to fit into gears with tooth counts under about 100. That is an engineer's compromise, a designer standing between mathematics and metal. Follow that all the way through. If the front display really showed planetary positions, as the inscriptions and constraints strongly suggest, then somewhere in the Greek world, there were people who knew how to compress a cosmos into bronze, build it, box it, label it, and ship it as cargo. Maybe as a luxury object, maybe as a teaching instrument, maybe as the product of a small specialist tradition. But if even one such workshop existed, what vanished was not a single object. It was a chain: theory, fabrication, apprenticeship, patronage, and a buyer who understood what he was paying for. You can feel the missing sections by looking at what survives. About 2/3 of the mechanism is gone. The most spectacular part, the front planetary display, is still reconstructed rather than preserved. Scholars are not reading a complete machine. They are rebuilding one from fragments, inscriptions, and the hard limits imposed by gears that still exist. We know enough to be stunned. We do not know enough to see the whole hand that made it. That is why this object rises to the top of the list. The curse here is not death around the artifact, though the wreck killed for it. The curse is asymmetry. We have the answer but not the method. We have the result but not the workshop. We can name the cycles, count the gears, read parts of the instructions, and still cannot point with confidence to the vanished line of makers. For all the museum glass and modern scans, the most valuable thing on that ship may have been the know-how required to make another one. Imagine the scene plainly. A box of corroded fragments from a wreck more than 2,000 years old sits in front of you. You count 30 gears. You read instructions etched into bronze. You watch eclipse cycles emerge from the damage. Then you go looking for its twin, and there is no next room to walk into. That absence turns the artifact from a marvel into evidence. If this mechanism was normal inside some lost circle of experts, then that circle ended. A patron died. A library burned. Trade routes broke. Empires shifted. A workshop lost its students. Hard-won knowledge, concentrated and useful, almost vanished with them. One broken survivor remained and made the future look stupid. The Antikythera Mechanism is not out of time in any magical sense. It is out of time in the archival sense. It is what remains after a technical tradition collapses so completely that later centuries no longer know what is missing. The men who first saw it had no idea. To them, it was one more encrusted piece from a lethal wreck, one ugly lump among statues, easy to ignore. History nearly did. Then the bronze cracked open and showed its teeth. As one early report put it, there was a gear wheel